Okay, let's take a look at biases a little bit closer. I know we've introduced the topic of biases recently, and we need to really understand what they're all about. Biases are basically how your point of view is impacted one way or another. So there's no such thing as an objective point of view. No matter how we try to ignore it, human communication takes place in context. And that context could be what's going on around you. It could be the person that's giving you the information could be biased, could have their own value set going on. And it's through mediums, individuals, groups who are situated historically, politically, economically, and socially. So this contextual information is coming at you from a lot of different sources, and you need to understand what the biases of those sources are. So, for example, politicians are really biased. We already know that. And we also pretty much know that journalists, too, are biased, and they speak from their own political position, but they try not to be overtly uh, uh, biased. But actually, that's not quite true anymore. They're kind of bragging about how biased they are in some cases, and we'll get into that a little bit further down the road. So, is this still true today? How does it explain what happened with Donna Brazile during the Clinton campaign in 2016? Donna Brazile was, I think, the head of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee at that time, and she came across some information in her role as a reporter that had meaning to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and she passed that information unethically over to Clinton. So her bias was very, very strong at that point in time. So let's talk a little bit about journalists. Excuse me. So the press is usually thought of in general terms, the press, a unified voice with a distinct bias, either left or right, depending on who the journalist is. So a prime example today would be Fox News versus CNN. So each of them have their biases. Fox is thought to be right wing. CNN is thought to be very much left wing liberal. So for readers and viewers, it's important that we develop the ability to know this, to discern the level and amount and type of bias that's being used by any of these sources. So how do we do that? So who are the people? Who are the news media? Traditional news is the old newspapers, magazines, things like that, television channels. Modern, though, has taken on a new voice. It's online. Modern news is online, and it comes at us through reborn traditionals. You've got the reborn television channels, etc., and it's coming at us through kind of blogs that are turned into news sources, such as the homicide report in Los Angeles, where a reporter actually created a journal of the people that got shot to death in South Central Los Angeles on a daily basis for the LA Times, and it is a very huge database, by the way, but she's using that to make a very strong point, and you can imagine what that point is. Then the online bunch have evolved quite a bit. Blogs that just are mom and pop kind of blogs, they're typically grassroots. They've evolved into news sources as well. Those that are completely evolutionary, by the way, are anybody with access to social media. I could come up with a blog right now on Facebook, or in fact I have. You could come up with a blog using Instagram, Twitter. You might go out and get WordSpeak, or you might get any of the easy plug and play kind of website design tools and go out and make your own WordPress or Wix or any of those into what could credibly appear to be a very strong, well-funded, well-designed news service that's just you. So who knows? How does anybody know what's behind the news? What's running and what's operating? They have to get in there, and you have to get in there and try to detect that bias. So how do you do that? You've got commercial biases, which is they're there to make money. They want to make money, so they're going to give you bad news because guess what sells? People don't like to read good news. It's just boring, they think, and they love to watch like bad news sells a lot. It's the train wreck theory. So news media are biased toward that. They try to tell stories that have conflict, that have controversy. And controversy, by the way, is the biggest number one selling tool that the news media have. So there's a temporal bias. A temporal bias is something that has to be engaging, something that has to get people talking about it. They take a little thing and they kind of blow it out of proportion, such as CNN. Every story seems to have that sweeping in breaking news kind of thing, and they use that same breaking news for 3 days on a story that's been out for a week. I mean, how breaking can it possibly be? But breaking news is sometimes something that catches your attention, that gives you a temporal bias. There's a visual bias. How many times have we seen, or are we going to see, the same pictures and videos online, especially if you happen to turn on a TV or go on the news channels online around the time of the insurgency in Washington, D.C., when tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000+ people attacked our Capitol building. Americans attacked their own Capitol building with the threat of actually kidnapping and or killing congresspeople. I don't know if there's any truth to that. I don't even know if that's a bias. I just repeated myself. But how many times are we going to see those pictures, the same ones, over and over again? Cop getting clubbed over the head by flagpole, or somebody throwing a fire hydrant or a fire extinguisher and hitting a cop in the head, and it bounces off and hits another cop in the head. By the way, that one police officer died from that. So how many times are we going to see people using a plastic shield to break a window to go into the Capitol building? How many times are we going to hear about or see about the young lady who climbed through that window and got shot, immediately died? So they're doing this for a reason. It's what we used to call sensationalism. It's what used to get the attention. And if you don't believe that kind of junk sells, take a look at the history of National Enquirer or Sun or World or any of those sensationalistic rags that you can buy at the checkout stand at Safeway, and you'll see what I mean. Those things are making fortunes for their owners, even though they print mostly lies and sensationalistic lies to boot. And then there's the bad news bias. This forces the media to paint politicians as inherently worse than they actually are. If you believe some of the news channels, you'll think that Donald Trump eats his children, or you think that maybe Joe Biden is like the biggest goofball in the world, and Bernie Sanders is a communist, and Joe Biden's son is in bed with the Ukrainians, and all those things. You'd hear these things, and they're painting these politicians as horrible, horrible, horrible people. Some of them might be, not all of them are. Just know that they're doing it for the reason that I painted. That's money. It's all about money. So, fairness bias, that's kind of a self-canceling phrase, fair bias, is a real thing. Ethical practice demands that journalists be fair. Now, understand that ethical practice is kind of a thing of the past these days. When you look at what happened at Fox News recently, Lou Dobbs was just fired today as we speak. He was a very strong, long-time reporter, and they counted on him to be one of the lead spokesmen to support the Trump regime. And now that the Trump regime, and by the way, the QAnon theory is all going away, they're getting rid of the people who put them in that position. And here's why they're doing it: because the people, the software company that manufactures all of the voting equipment, these people on Fox News said a lot of bad things about the voting equipment to try to prove that the vote was robbed and stolen from Trump. And now they're suing for like $2.7 billion, Fox News and all the people at Fox News that made these claims. So they're trying to cover themselves by firing Lou Dobbs, and they're going to fire other people too. So it's just ethical practice demands that journalists be fair. Well, it was mandated by law years ago. And what I mean by that is when John Kennedy and Richard Nixon ran against each other, there was something called the equal time laws. Equal time meant that the news media were required to give an equal amount of airtime to opponents. So, for example, if they gave John F. Kennedy an hour-long interview, they were then required to give another hour to Richard M. Nixon for him to do as he sees fit. So that kind of went out the window. They got rid of that sometime in the late 1990s, but it was for many years the equal fair time laws were very strong, and they did really enforce them. So theoretically, they're ethically required to pay as much attention to each side. Theoretically, no longer legal requirement, just theoretically ethical behavior dictates that they do that. So this becomes transparent and can make some pretty boring news, so they just don't do it anymore. They don't do it. You can tell me that Fox News gives as much coverage to the conservative side as they give to the liberal side, and vice versa at CNN. And I'm just going to tell you, you're going to have to prove it because I haven't seen it. Okay, so then there's glory biases. Glory biases where the media blows things out of proportion. They make people famous. News rock stars, Sean Hannity, Wolf Blitzer, Chris Cuomo. All these people are people that you've probably heard of at some point. They make these people into celebrities, and they make them into celebrities because it makes people want to watch them, and it's called the glory bias. So we tend to look at these people as being above the rest, as being smarter than the average, and they're really not. They're just people. They're just reporters like everybody else, but they've been placed on a pedestal, and we as readers and viewers are supposed to see them differently, and we need to be careful not to do that. So how do we detect biases in the news? First, check the sources. They all have sources, and we need to check those sources. For example, news media usually rely on government officials and retired officials. You go on to CNN and you'll see these people coming on, and they have a panel there, and they have, let's say, Wolf Blitzer, and he's asking individuals on the panel for their points of view. And if you look at these people, they're retired from Obama administration, from Nixon administration, they're all different people from different administrations. So they're just going to give you their own bias, their own flavor of what the truth is. So this creates a biased and unfair portrayal of some pretty boring news, by the way. Now, then you have to take a look at the number of corporate and government versus progressive public interest, female, minority voices. How many of them are black? How many of them are LGBTQ? How many of them are female? How many of them are marginalized people? Are they taking points of view from people like us? And if they're not, then they are biased in the way that we don't want them to be biased, aren't they? Is there any diversity on the panel? Do they, in their sources, give you diversity? Do they tell you what it's like for the rich people versus these tax cuts that Trump put out there? How is it for the billionaires, and how is it for you and I? This doesn't include their personalities alone. It expands to include their guests. So who are they bringing on? Who are they listening to? How many times you see people like Bill Gates out there being interviewed? How many times do you see people out there like generals, retired generals out there being interviewed? So pay attention to who they're interviewing and what the meaning to you is as someone who wants to take their information and rely on it for your own essay support. So, for example, PBS found that 97% of the people were white and 87% of the people on interview shows were male. So 87% of them were male and 97% of them were white. What does that tell you? They're interviewing people like themselves. Okay, how do you evaluate them? You have to first say, whose point of view are they reporting? Is this a point of view that is meaningful? Is this going to give me what I need to get? Or is this just some more of the same stuff? So political news reporting often focuses on things of interest to politicians, officials, corporate, people that aren't like us, not the public at large. And so Whose point of view is being reported? Are there double standards going on out there? Oh my goodness, are there double standards? So they'll give you a story about how these tax cuts were so good when you realize that they really were only good for people who were billionaires. So they're just giving you their point of view that doesn't matter to you. Here's another one. How many times you see stories, a black youth who commits crimes is called a predator or a criminal. But a white-collar criminal is called an unfortunate who was led astray. Or he had lost his job, so he felt the need to. And they just give you this sob story. But that black youth who did it is, oh, he's a bad guy. Got to stay away from him. Some think tanks are funded by corporations that are not usually identified as biased toward the needs of the funding corporation, but they are absolutely biased toward the needs of the funding corporation. All these think tanks out there that are giving you their information get their money from someone. That someone wants them to give reports that are biased toward that someone. They're paying for it. Be careful. See who's paying for it. Stereotypes. Drug crisis. They focus on the African American, don't they? Don't they? Somewhat now. They give you that passing phrase that says, well, it's actually a suburban problem now. It's moved out into the suburbs. Well, yeah, that's true. But for years it's been all an African American problem. Do they gloss over that stereotype? Do they gloss over that? Sure they do. They talk about the poor kid, the white kid, who got hooked by the doctor. The doctor got them addicted. They don't say that about the African American kid, do they? They say that kid's out there selling drugs on the corner. Stereotypes. Does the coverage of women on welfare focus on African American women? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Are lesbians portrayed as man-haters and are gay men portrayed as predators? Not so much anymore, but for a long time they were. Now, I say not so much anymore. I can hear some of you saying, oh yeah, but what about? And there's a lot of truth to that. Oh yeah, but what about? They somewhat are. So there are hidden assumptions at play too. You have to look for what they're not saying. Is the rape victim thought of as a loose participant in the crime? Is that still happening? You bet it is. How about that kid at Stanford whose career was going to go away because he just got carried away, had a few too many drinks, and found himself on top of a dumpster raping a young lady? Poor boy. Poor boy. And that girl, if she hadn't had all those drinks, she wouldn't have been in that position. You recall that story? It's a real one. It's right here in our faces. Are liberals assumed to be pro-choice? Conservatives assumed to be pro-life? Yes. Yes. Are black gunshot victims assumed to have caused their demise? Cop told him to stop. That's why he shot him 7 times in the back. And that's a real story about a guy that got pulled over by a cop for a broken taillight. He was told to stop running. The cop pulled out a gun and shot the guy 7 times in the back as he ran away. If only would have obeyed the order to stop. Has this started to change? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I thought it had, but then we had what happened with I Can't Breathe. And then we had what happened with Black Lives Matter, and what a magnificent movement that's turned out to be. Are pro-Second Amendment supporters assumed to be Republicans? Well, of course they are. Of course they are. You're trying to take away my Second Amendment. Who says that? Republicans. You don't hear that too often from Democrats. But Democrats have the same feelings. Republicans have the same feelings. But the news paint it as being, and they prove it by giving you, here's an example of a Republican saying, you're trying to take away my Second Amendment. Or here's a sign carrying Save Our Babies and they call that a Republican. There's a person that's a conservative, a Republican, who's trying to save the babies by getting rid of the abortion rights. I don't care what your belief is. The media is going to paint it as you're conservative if you say that. Okay. Remember, there's no such thing as an objective point of view. There are biases in everything we do, think, say, read, hear, watch. Everything. No matter how much we want to rate the information as dependable and reliable, we have the responsibility as writers and researchers to dig, to uncover that stuff. Find out, are there any biases in the source material? Now, on your own, I would like you to go to the handbook, the Critical Thinking Handbook. That's downloadable here in files. If you haven't done that already, I suggest you do download it and either save it as a PDF file or print it out. You can have it on your phone, for example. But anyhow, on page 15, not 14, 15, there is a story. And I'm going to ask you to analyze that story. I want you to read the story. It's called What is Confirmation Bias? And here's why I want you to do that. Because confirmation bias has to do with what you already thought before you started researching. I ask you a question. Do you prefer hamburgers or hot dogs? Do most students prefer hamburgers or hot dogs? You're going to have an answer to that question in the back of your head. Whether you say it out loud or not is not the issue, but you're going to have your own leaning, your own bias toward that question. That's called bias. Then you go out to prove that you're right. That's called confirmation. And so a confirmation cognitive bias means that you are setting out to prove that you're right all along. I can tell you that in our discussion of this past week, a lot of you did that. A lot of you went out and said, here's the claim I'm going to use because it proves what I believe. Well, that's admirable, but it doesn't do any of us any good. Because the reason we do research is to find out if our thinking is right, not to prove that it was all along. And remember, in one presentation, I said to you, you might be wrong. A critical thinker has the need to know. It's that curiosity factor. They need to know. They want to know. They want to find out what's right and what's wrong. So you have to make sure that you actually do the research before you lock in on your claim. There will be questions on that. Sorry, it's not cognitive, it's confirmation bias. Everybody get that right. Confirmation bias on page 14 and 15. There will be questions on the midterm about that. So I want you to go in, I want you to read that, and I want you to really understand it and try to internalize the fact that I'm asking you to become critical thinkers. When I ask you the question that you're going to have to answer in your essay on social media and its impact on mental health, I want you to take whatever you believe in your heart, what you think automatically, what we call knee-jerk opinion is, and take that opinion and prove it to be wrong. I want you to go out, set out, and try to find a piece of research that proves you wrong. If you can't, if you do a genuine search and you can't find anything that proves you wrong, then you probably were right and your claim will stand. If, on the other hand, you're like me, once in a while you're going to find stuff that kind of shakes your earth on you. It says, wait a minute, you might have been right, but what about this? What about that? Or here's something you didn't think about. And maybe it'll open your mind a little bit more. And that's what I'm hoping that you'll do. Because quite frankly, in those discussions, I found a little bit too much of the system one thinking. A little bit too much of the, I already know the answer, so I'm going to go out and prove it right. Do not do that. Please don't do that. Okay, that's the end of this presentation, and it's going to be available to you whenever you want it to be.